really sorry that it's taken me so long to actually get round to filming this. It's actually been really, really difficult with a newborn, particularly a newborn that cluster feeds every hour and has done for the last 3 weeks. But hopefully that'll now be solved due to a tongue tie issue. But little one is just having a sleep. How long that will last for, I don't know, because she's already been down for an hour, so it's literally like a ticking time bomb as to when she'll wake up. But I wanted to film my birth story while it was still fresh in my mind. And I know that when I was pregnant, I was always searching for positive birth stories, particularly induction ones, because as I will take you through, my birth ended up being induced. And I really struggled to come to terms with that. I got myself in a little bit of an anxious state, and actually the essence of it is that I didn't need to, but I really struggled to find positive birth stories that were induction, and particularly around the hypnobirthing induction positive stories I really struggled to find. So I wanted to make my own, so that if there's anyone else in a similar position, you can listen to this. So here is my story. I had my heart set all along on a midwifery-led birth on the MLBU at the North Norwich University Hospital. I wanted a hypnobirth with very limited pain relief, and I was going to have a water birth, is everything I'd set my heart on. Now, the requirements to get on the MLBU unit is that you are, it's a fit and well pregnancy up to that point. You have to be in active labour, and you have to be in active labour up to midnight on the 42 weeks. So you've got until midnight on that day to be in active labour, to be able to get onto the unit, that you've had no history of any other complications, and as and when your waters break, that there's no meconium, whereby the baby has passed its stools in your stomach, really, which can then cause other complications. So your waters have to be clear. I had, as my due date kind of passed and went and was ending up to be a distant memory, I was trying every method under the sun to try and get my labour going naturally. If you mentioned it, I had probably already tried it, and if you are in this position where you're watching this video now, I'm sure you're in the same position where you were going through the same feelings I was, which was jealousy of anybody who even mentioned that they'd gone into labour early, in particular, prior to their due date, or certainly within a few days of their due date. I didn't want to hear any of that. Who wanted to suggest pineapple and curry. You just end up nodding and smiling, even though you are consuming copious amounts of that anyway. So yeah, I was still desperate for a natural birth. So as and when the midwives mentioned about booking an induction date, I was really reluctant, and I ended up plumbing for booking an induction date on my 42nd day, which was the latest the midwives were willing to book it. It then would have meant that I was 14 days overdue. Bear in mind, your baby isn't overdue. There is a 5-week window that your baby can arrive, and that's from 37 weeks to 42 weeks, and only 3% actually arrive on their due date. On the morning of Saturday the 12th of May, I got a phone call from the ward at approximately 9:30 to say that there was a bed ready for me, so could I make my way in and bring my bags with me. I had, in order to prepare for the birth, and regardless of where that birth was, I had been listening to my positive affirmations religiously. I'd reread up on all the various different pain relief options. So although I wanted a drug-free birth, I was open to options should I need them at the time. This was my first baby, so I didn't really know what to expect, and I wanted to prepare for every eventuality. And I got into my head and remembered the fact that although we had got some things ready to prepare for, like the water birth room, the MLBU room, just because it was going to be a room on a different ward didn't mean that we couldn't have those things. So we still had electric candles, we still had our music playlist, which happened to be the music from our wedding, so there was then some happy memories that we could kind of relax and talk about, or just have positive connotations about. I had a YouTube video ready to watch, which I had made myself, which was all to do with swimming in the sea in Cos, and then that was going to be my happy place that I would then go back to as and when labour began. I also took in my aromatherapy oils and all those things that you're going to take, or I'd planned to take to the MLBU. It was no different I could take to the delivery suite. It was just going to be a different room. So we made our way into Cly ward at the Norfolk and Norwich with all our items, because you don't know when it's actually going to begin, and at 2:30 in the afternoon a ProPes was inserted. Now this looked completely different to what I imagined. It's classed as a pessary, so if anyone has ever had like thrush before, you can get pessary treatment for that, and that looks very similar to a tampon, or is a tablet that you insert, very similar to a tampon. However, this looked completely different. This actually was tape, really thin tape, which then had a plastic tape bit at the end. It was very odd. But that is then inserted in you, and the string then hangs down, and that lasts for 24 hours. So once that is inserted, that is it. They do not then examine you or do anything more for 24 hours. We had misunderstood this, so this probably is a good time to explain that. I thought it was, or we all thought that it was then going to get things going naturally. Which that isn't really the aim of the ProPes. The aim of the ProPes is actually just to dilate your cervix enough to get to your waters. In few cases it can get things going naturally, because as your cervix dilates, then the pressure from the baby can then break your waters naturally, and you can go into spontaneous labour. However, that's very rare, particularly for a first time labour. So us thinking that we were actually then going to have a baby on a Saturday was not the case, and that then kind of had to reset our brains for that. So this was inserted, and then I went for copious walks and bouncing on the ball and doing anything I could, anything but laying on the bed, because if you lay on the bed then you're more likely to have a back-to-back labour. So keeping upright as much as possible, bouncing on the ball, going for walks around the hospital, and keeping active in a bid to get the labour going spontaneously, because in the back of my head I still thought, or had the thought, that I could get on to MLBU if I was in spontaneous labour up until midnight that night. So at that point I was on a countdown of I had 10 hours left to get things going naturally. By the time it came to the evening, I decided I actually wanted to spend the night at home. I felt I was going to be more relaxed and I'd be in a better chance of going into spontaneous labour, and also I thought I would get a better night's sleep for as and when things did kick off. This wasn't part of the process for the hospital, and throughout any decision of your labour I would thoroughly recommend you follow the route of or the acronym BRAIN. I'll put it down the side of the screen here because I can't actually remember what it stands for, but the gist of it is to weigh up every single decision that you make throughout, in terms of risks, the benefits, what are the alternatives, and that kind of thing, and make a decision for yourself based on that, and you make an informed decision for yourself, not just following whatever is the medical guidelines. The medical guidelines at that point is because I was on the 14th day, I was being induced on the 14th day, that from the 15th day your placenta can be less effective. Because of this, they then said they were going to do increased monitoring, but what that increased monitoring actually entailed was me telling them if baby's movements had decreased. If they hadn't, then they were just going to monitor me and the baby again at 8 AM the following morning. I weighed up the risks in that there was nothing to say that my due date was actually correct, so I didn't believe, personal opinion, again I'm not a medical expert, but in my head, again, there wasn't going to be a time I go off at midnight and my placenta suddenly go, oh, you know what, we need to start deteriorating. There was nothing to say that my due date was out by a couple of days. And actually, if you go to countries such as France, and I think there is another one, their pregnancy and their due dates are actually scheduled at the 44th day. So at the between 42 and 44 weeks. It's only in the UK where we then bring it back to 40 weeks. So, and I think their babies are all safe. And if we can't, as a population, agree on how long it takes to cook a baby, then I wasn't dead set on the fact that my placenta was going to start rupturing at the 15th day. But that's not to say that it didn't, so please do not take my medical advice. This was a decision I had weighed up for myself. In terms of monitoring the movements, I don't live too far away from the hospital, and the ward was incredibly busy. That's no disrespect to them, but I also felt that if there was decreased movements, the 10 minutes it would take me to get from home to the hospital would be exactly the same 10 minutes it would take for them to answer my call bell. So I took the decision to actually discharge myself, and I came home and rested up at home and returned back to the ward for 7:30 the next morning, ready for monitoring. And I had the best night's sleep ever, and I'm very glad that I did. We went back in for the monitoring and discussed things with the consultant the next morning, and as it was, baby was fine, I was fine. We were just waiting for the ProPES still to take effect, and we wouldn't know what effect that was going to be until 2:30 that afternoon. At 2:30 that afternoon, the ProPES was taken out, and I then had another examination, and that determined that I was 1 centimetre dilated, and that they would then have access to my waters. At the same time as the ProPES being removed, the midwife actually offered me a sweep, which I accepted, because again, it could mean that things could get going naturally, and I wouldn't then have to have kind of any intervention. I accepted that offer, and it was a very good sweep. It was a very skilled midwife, and following that we then went on several walks. Now, whether that sweep actually played a part in then what happened later on, I will never know, but I'll just tell you the birth. I'll just tell you stories. Throughout, in order to keep calm, I was listening to my positive affirmations continuously, and I actually put my phone on flight mode. I didn't want to speak to friends and family, which may sound really, really weird, but I needed to keep my head in the zone and keep myself calm. I didn't want to keep repeating to people about what was going on with the induction process and really talk about it too much, because I just wanted to keep focused. And then Mark was the gatekeeper for all information, so he spoke to my immediate family to keep them up to date, and they then communicated out to, say, additional people. So my mum communicated to my sisters, my dad communicated to my nan, and Mark's mum and dad were passing messages down to Mark's sisters. And it also, and in terms of friends, they knew that I was away, I was kind of busy, and then I will be in contact as and when there was news or if I needed them in the meantime. But definitely listening to my positive affirmations in the middle kind of kept my anxiety to a minimum. At 9:30 that evening, finally a bed became free on delivery suite, and we then walked through to our new room, where we met our midwife. In terms of the induction process so far, I would say there is no need to be anxious. The only thing about it is that I think you have more opportunity to build it up in your head. It is no different to a plaster being taken off, in terms of if someone just ripped it off, you wouldn't think anything of it. But if someone said, I'm going to rip that plaster off in 15 minutes time, you then start worrying about what that's going to feel like, what's going to happen, is it going to hurt, and I think that's exactly what happens with the induction process, in terms of, because you know there's a scheduled time and a date, you then start building things up in your mind. Whereas if you'd gone into labour spontaneously, you wouldn't have had chance to do any of that. So hopefully that at this point in time will put your mind in rest about the induction process. All it is doing is pressing the button to get things going. The actual process wasn't hideous. Going back to the story, so at 9:30 we progressed through, and we talked through with the midwife in terms of what our birth wishes were, in terms of we'd hoped for a water birth, And at this point, that was still on the cards. There's one bath available on delivery suites, so although chances would be slim in terms of availability, as long as you didn't have the drip, I was allowed into the bath. I also talked through them in terms of pain relief, in that I didn't want pethidine. Again, these are all personal choices. I didn't like the side effects on the mum or the baby, and I didn't want a bed-based birth. I had been advised by my physio not to have epidural due to I had SPD and pelvis issues throughout my pregnancy, so that wasn't going to sit very well with me. In terms, I wouldn't be able to feel when my legs were then too wide for my pelvis issue. I wouldn't be able to communicate that actually that's uncomfortable. So an epidural was out, and again that was going to lead to a bed-based birth, which I didn't want. However, I was open to paracetamol, Oromorph and gas and air, all of which you're allowed if you also have a water birth. When you have your waters broken, you are entitled to 2 hours unless there is a medical reason why not, at which point obviously again you can make the decision yourself as to whether you go with that or not, but you are actually entitled to 2 hours to get your labour going naturally. Bear in mind I was obviously still playing for this water birth at this point in time, and so I voiced the fact that I wanted that 2 hours to get things going, rather than having the oxytocin drip which inserted straight away. The oxytocin drip is a synthetic drip, oxytocin, which can get labour going. When you go into labour, it is the hormone oxytocin that gets things moving. It's the happy hormone, so basically it's just a replication of that, but I wanted to get things going without the use of the drip if at all possible, which the midwife then respected, and we would then give things a go. Because of this, we'd actually left Mark's snack bag, which had all our food in, an additional change of clothes and things for Mark, and the baby's bag in the car, because we were obviously planning to go for a walk in a bid to get things going naturally. Thankfully I did have excuse me, thankfully I did have my bag on me, with drinks in, because I had this from Clive Ward still. At 10:15 we actually had my waters broken. The utensil to break them is actually far more frightening than the actual feeling. I didn't feel a thing. Following on from cervical smears, which I have to admit I found incredibly uncomfortable. I've had people tell me that they found it absolutely fine. I found all of them really uncomfortable for me, and so I was then dreading this, particularly when I saw the tool, which looks basically like a cross between a knitting needle and a crochet hook. It's a long thin hook with a tiny little hook on the end. So when I saw this, I was really dreading it. I didn't feel a thing, absolute thing. From the bottom of my heart, I can assure you of that. The only thing I then did feel, which was the strangest sensation in the world, was all this warm water gushing out, and it did feel like a gush. Basically like I'd had a really massive wee and I couldn't stop, and it was, like I say, very, very warm, very, very wet, and you're lying on a bed in it. So that was probably the most disgusting thing, but that could have happened at home, that could have happened there. All they've done is that they've broken them for me, and the losing of the liquid still continued as and when I then got up off the bed, and made my way to the bathroom, and then proceeded to get dressed again, because obviously we're going to go for a walk. In the time it took me to get to the bathroom and get back to then put on my leggings again, and begin to leave the room, I can actually leave the room. The surges were beginning to come thick and fast. I had backache throughout the day, which could have been to do with the sweep, which is why I mentioned that it may have had contributions to that, or it may have just been the fact it was just one of them things that was going to happen, or I'd put it down to sitting on the ball all day, because I never ever found bouncing on a ball that comfortable for me throughout the pregnancy. But my backache was intense, really intense, really intense cramps at the back, which then would come down my thighs and up my stomach. And like I said, these had started occurring by 10 o'clock, so within 15 minutes of my waters breaking. We immediately got the room set up, so we had the playlist playing. Mark got my aromatherapy oils out, so I was smelling clary sage and lavender on a damp flannel. We had our music playing, we had our tea lights on, and Mark was generally just trying to talk to me and try and keep me calm and coach me through my breathing. Within an hour, I was really feeling that these were intense, and I wasn't expecting things to happen this quick. And I have to admit, at that point, I was losing my cool, because I couldn't get my head around the fact that how I was going to cope with this for the next potentially 10 hours or 12 hours or however long this was going to go on for. Because as far as I was aware, this was the very beginning, and I wasn't expecting things to be so intense so quickly. A quick examination revealed that the baby had actually gone back to back. Now, baby has never been back to back throughout the whole of the pregnancy, and I don't know why the baby decided to go back to back then. However, they had. And that has kind of boded well since baby has arrived. They certainly do things on their own terms. I'm saying they because then I'll reveal the gender at the end. I was then offered for them to manually turn the baby, which I declined. Again, I wanted to keep things as natural as possible, and decided that I would try and turn the baby myself by keeping upright, leaning as forward as possible, and depending on how uncomfortable I was feeling at the time, going on all fours, because gravity will then pull the baby's back round. It isn't always obviously guaranteed, but they're certainly the most natural methods you can do to try. And it was at this point I was then offered gas and air, which I gratefully accepted. When I was using the gas and air, I found it helpful to actually count how many breaths it took me to get through a surge. At the time, it was taking me 5 deep breaths, so I could then count down that I knew, as soon as I got to 3, I knew I was then on the downward peak of a surge. And I could then have a quick breather and gather my breath. Now, breath was the most vital tool throughout the whole of the labour. And as long as you keep calm, as soon as I then calmed down, things got so much easier. I progressed in this way for another 3 hours, and I did actually feel the baby turn in this time, and the sensations on my back then lessened. So I knew, and I could feel the baby. It felt like a washing machine turning. I could feel the baby turning. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the midwife actually suggested that I should start pushing. On hindsight, I wish I'd gone with my gut a bit more, in that I always believed you'd then get a sensation to start pushing, and I didn't have that sensation. So I believe I actually probably started pushing prior to being ready. But within half an hour of that, I did then get those sensations to start pushing. All the while, still on gas and air, still upright. I had not got on the bed at all, and purely used the gas and air and the breath. In terms of, I didn't know what to expect in terms of pushing, but all I can relate it to is if you've had a really bad stomach upset and you have to run to the toilet, you know, you get that urge of, I've got to go and I cannot stop it. It is that to a T, but far more intense, really. You have to, and it's basically the same as pushing out a poo. Sorry to be graphic, but for anyone who's not been there before, like I didn't know what to expect. And you just get this overwhelming urge to push, and essentially it is your uterus just coming up to then push the baby down. So I started pushing at 3 o'clock. After an hour, things hadn't really progressed that far, and although I'd been drinking a lot of liquid, I hadn't actually output any. And you're meant to go to the toilet at least every hour, potentially even half an hour if you can do it, to try and empty your bladder so it doesn't obstruct the baby coming out. And they felt that this may be why the baby wasn't progressing as well as we'd hoped. I tried to go to the toilet, nothing came out, so they then took the decision to fit a catheter. I was actually finding that my back was very uncomfortable and couldn't actually lie on my back comfortably at all, even with gas and air. And so they ended up fitting the catheter on the side while I was laying on my side, which again I found very uncomfortable, but was far more doable than laying on my back. This isn't the standard procedure, so maybe not every doctor would be happy to fit it in this way. And although it went in, it wasn't fitted perfectly, but it was enough to drain some liquid out, but again, very minimal. It may have been because I'd been going for so long, and I'd actually I was drenched in sweat. I didn't actually realise how physically vigorous labour was going to be, and this is probably why I didn't actually was outputting a lot of fluid, because I was outputting it in different ways. Following the fitting of the catheter, I then pushed for a further 2 hours. Now, although it sounds like a really long time now, when you're in the moment, it really does fly by. The first hour also didn't, but that was when I was in a state of anxiety and I had to get my head back in the game, basically, and that's the biggest bit of advice to you. If you can keep calm, which I know everyone tells you and it's really hard to do at the time, but as soon as I then regained control of my breath again and actually got my head into the space, things flew by, and it really doesn't feel like 2 seconds. I then pushed for another 2 hours, which was then the maximum amount of time of pushing. I'd actually technically in all been pushing for 3 hours, whereas 2 is actually the opt-in that they will allow you to do. But because I'd had the break in between, I had actually been pushing for 3, and we kind of got away with it. But I could feel that the baby was not progressing past the base of my spine. I could feel the baby there. It felt like a massive poo. And no matter how hard I was pushing, it just wasn't progressing. Due to being induced, we had been monitoring the baby's heart throughout, and suddenly the baby's heart rate did drop. Now, at this point in time, if you're listening to this as a labour story, this might not sound positive, but please hang on to the end, and I'll then put your mind all at rest. We then had a team of people rush in because the baby was in distress. I was placed on a bed, and due to the amount of gas and air and sheer exhaustion, I really wasn't in a position to be making decisions myself. And thankfully, throughout the whole of the hypnobirthing course and all our antenatal courses, Mark and I had discussed extensively what kind of birth we wanted, and what my greatest fears were, and the things that I would accept and things I wouldn't. And so he really took on the mantle and made the decisions for me, in terms of we were going to have some intervention in the form of either an assisted birth or a C-section to try and get this baby out. As I wasn't able to lie on my back, they weren't able to actually assess me, and so we were going to go and have to go into theatre, where I was going to need a spinal block, as an epidural was going to take too long to take effect, and I'd only had gas and air up until this point. Had I had an epidural at the beginning, then they would just have to top it up and we would have then been able to go, but I'd chosen to go with gas and air, and I'm still happy that I did to this point. It was scary at the time, however the team were fantastic. They briefed us both and kept us both calm in a slightly unsettling situation. The midwife coordinator actually came with me while Mark was being gowned up to come into theatre with me, and was trying to keep me calm. And they tried to administer the spinal block, and they had to do this with me laying on my side, curled into a C as much as I possibly could, which is no mean feat when you have a big bump in the way. They had also stopped the contractions in the meantime, and once the spinal block was in place, I literally could not feel anything from under my arms down. This was because we still didn't know at this point whether it was going to be an assisted birth or a C-section, so they had prepped me for a C-section just in case we were going to have to go into this. And because of that, again, there was a lot of people in the theatre because we had both teams present. As it was when they examined me, yes, they could see that the baby was right at the base of my spine, and for whatever reason had got stuck in the birth canal, but they would be able to do this via forceps to bring them out. which again sounds a hell of a lot worse than it actually is. In order to get the contractions going again, they actually inserted the oxytocin drip, which would have been the same one that I would have got had I accepted the drip right at the beginning of the induction process. And I was then going to have to push with the baby while they tried to get the baby out with the forceps. Due to not being able to feel anything, they actually were coaching me as to when my my contractions were happening. And you don't actually get any feeling of pushing whatsoever. It was the most bizarre thing in the world. All I felt like I was doing was, but you had to actually remember how to push is the bizarre thing. So the oxytocin drip was actually inserted at 7:04 a.m. and at 7:06 a.m. My beautiful baby was placed on my chest. They followed, even though we were in a theatre, and although things had taken obviously a completely different turn, they followed our birth wish list as much as they possibly could. So I had skin to skin. They didn't tell us the gender of the baby, as we wanted Mark to tell, to see it first and then to tell me. We also had delayed cord clamping, and Mark was able to cut the cord. And they honoured all of this, and you know exactly what they could, despite the circumstances. So at 7:06 a.m. the baby was placed on my chest underneath my gown for some skin to skin, and Mark, through his tears, and in 11 years I've never ever seen him cry. He didn't even well up on our wedding day, which I remind him constantly, but I actually saw him sob on that day, and through his tears, water, which we were just delighted about, and I think ultimately relieved that just everything was over. So in total, the labour lasted for 9 hours. It was 7 hours of active labour, which on hindsight now sounds horrific, but really is not, because hours and time just flies by. The reason I wanted to do this video, and I really hope it hasn't kind of scared you even more, is that I've now, although things didn't go how I planned, the hypnobirthing really did help me, and I still maintain that you know is a really vital piece of your toolkit, and I still managed to do the birth on gas and air up until that point where things kind of took a turn for the less positive aspect. However, the ultimate gain was to have a baby, and we achieved that. And baby was fine, as was I. I was also really fearful of any damage down there, and I've come away with a 1 centimetre cut. That is it, despite everything that kind of went on. The other main bit of advice I would give you, and it's kind of the viewpoint I've now come to having, is almost positioning your birth in the same way as I did the wedding. On the lead up to the wedding, I was, you know, worried and fixated about the colour of the favours. Had I got enough buttonhole flowers? Were the cutlery the right design? Were the sashes the right shade of navy? And all the minutiae detail. But actually, when it comes to it, we got married, we had a fantastic day, and all the other bits and pieces just go into the story of the wedding and all those funny, you know, tales that you tell after. And I'm kind of viewing the birth in the same way, and I would give you the advice of viewing the birth in the same way. On the lead up, it is great to have ideals and your perfect scenario. However, I was so fixated on having an MLBU water birth that everything else was then a disappointment to me. And I felt almost a failure after, because I hadn't achieved what I'd set out to achieve. And that's not the case. That's not right. At the end of the day, I got a beautiful baby. I don't think I even ended the story in that 3 Mark's sobs. You know, we had a beautiful daughter, and she is my absolute world already, even after just 4 weeks. And yes, it didn't quite go the way I wanted it to, but it's about making the best decisions at the time. Using that acronym I said right at the very beginning, weighing up the risks, weighing up the benefits, weighing up the alternatives. Sorry, just listening for little one. I think someone's beginning to stir. And no, that wasn't, you know, going into theatre and having an assisted birth was absolutely not what I would have wanted. However, would I still choose to go for an assisted birth over a C-section? Absolutely. If it ultimately came to it of having no baby at all and having a C-section, would I have gone for a C-section? Of course I would. And there are still elements of that, although we didn't have the MLBU room, we were still able to implement in the delivery suite, and I was still able to progress right until the very end. And had she not got stuck in the birth canal, I would have done the whole labour just on gas and air, despite the baby being back to back, which can make it a lot more challenging, shall we say, and a lot more intense. So it is possible for you. I just want to say, like the induction process, you build up far more in your head. Ultimately, all it's doing is starting off the labour, which you were going to have anyway, whether that's spontaneous or whether someone is telling you they're about to rip off the plaster. The only person that will build this up and make this bigger is you, and that will be in your head. So do whatever you possibly can do to keep relaxed, to keep calm, and to focus on the fact that you're about to meet your beautiful baby, and every surge you have brings you closer. Be open to all sorts of pain relief. Don't just go in there on a fixed plan of this has got to happen and feeling, like I say, a failure or disregarding everything. Just make the decisions at the time, informed decisions. So do your homework before you go in, no different to any other exam or any other big life-changing event. But do your research and make your decisions at the time based on the situation. And make sure your birthing partner is fully equipped to have your back in situations where you're not capable of making the decisions, or certainly voicing the decisions yourself. But if you're about to meet your baby, I wish you the very best of luck, and I hope everything goes well for you. And I hope this video has helped you in some way, shape or form. It is possible to have a positive birth following an induction. It is possible to have a positive birth, even if it doesn't follow your set thinking of how you want it to go. And at the end of it, if you get your beautiful bundle of joy in your arms, you are a goddess and you have succeeded, and just appreciate exactly what your body has done. Now, my human alarm clock has just gone off, so I think that's the end of this video, and I will see you again soon. Thanks, bye.